opened with simple questions, and she answered with anything but simplicity, and in that moment, the temperature in the room shifted in a way cameras can't quite capture. The air inside the Russell Senate office building carried that familiar mix of polish and ambition, the scent of power that never really fades no matter how often the floors get redone. John Kennedy had arrived early, which felt unusual for someone who usually times an entrance like theater.
City Journal, which is published by the Manhattan Institute. And they are alleging that money, part of this $1 billion that was stolen, they are alleging that at least a portion of it went to a terrorist organization in Somalia that we've all heard of. It's notorious. It's an organization called Al-Shabaab. They hate Americans. They're terrorists. They want to kill Americans and drink their blood out of a boot.
He wore a Navy suit chosen with care, thin glasses that made him look more professor than pugilist, and shoes that suggested a long week. In his hand was a slim folder he set down gently, like it contained grocery receipts instead of political leverage. The hearing itself was billed as routine oversight, the kind of procedural exercise that usually hums along to half-empty rooms and C-SPAN background noise. Then the witness list leaked, and one name changed everything. Ilhan Omar was scheduled to testify, and suddenly every seat mattered. Reporters circled, producers rearranged schedules, and the hearing went from housekeeping to headline material overnight. Washington runs on moments like that, when process turns into spectacle without warning. Omar arrived precisely on time, surrounded by legal counsel and staffers carrying binders thick enough to double as doorstops. She looked composed, camera-ready, projecting the practiced calm of someone who has prepared for turbulence. Supporters filled the gallery early, some in coordinated shirts, others simply present to show solidarity. Media rows were packed tight, lenses angled like periscopes waiting for motion. The expectation in the room wasn't subtle. People came anticipating fireworks, not footnotes. Kennedy greeted her with a warmth that felt almost disarming, more front porch courtesy than cable news confrontation. He complimented her journey, her resilience, the improbable arc from refugee camp to Congress. For a brief moment, the exchange sounded less like politics and more like civic pride. A few people in the gallery relaxed, unsure if the tension they'd prepared for had been postponed. Compliments in Washington, though, often arrive with an asterisk. He adjusted his glasses, opened the folder, and said he preferred simple answers to simple questions. The tone stayed gentle, but the structure tightened. He mentioned financial disclosure forms, public records filed under penalty of perjury, numbers anyone could look up. One year showed modest assets, the next showed a dramatic jump. He wondered aloud how such leaps happen and whether ordinary voters could reasonably follow the math. Omar responded with measured explanations about business growth and valuation methods, the language of finance professionals, and disclosure rules. Kennedy nodded, acknowledging that numbers can move for many reasons, especially in ventures built on projections. Still, he lingered on bank balances, valuation gaps, and how confusing they might look to people outside investment circles. His questions didn't accuse, they lingered. The distinction matters in rooms where wording can carry more weight than evidence. The exchange turned into a conversation about perception versus paperwork, about how public statements and official filings sometimes read differently. Kennedy referenced interviews, disclosure forms, and the gap between working parent narratives and asset ranges that suggested something larger. Omar clarified distinctions between personal and household reporting, emphasizing compliance with rules. Viewers were left to interpret tone, timing, and nuance. In politics, interpretation often becomes its own storyline. From there, the discussion shifted to legislation intended to help families during difficult times. Kennedy framed the policy goal as humane and bipartisan, something few would oppose in principle. Then he referenced reported cases of fraud tied to programs that expanded during emergencies. He described the allegations as troubling and asked how oversight can keep pace with urgency. The implication wasn't personal guilt, but institutional vulnerability. Omar noted that she had supported investigations and accountability measures once irregularities surfaced. Kennedy asked about timelines, wondering whether responses came early enough to prevent harm. He listed indictments, convictions, and the frustration taxpayers feel when programs meant to help become cautionary tales. The room grew quieter, not hostile, just attentive. Policy debates often sound abstract until money and people enter the frame together. There was a moment when Kennedy spoke about families who rely on public programs, the kind who don't track subcommittees but feel outcomes directly. His voice slowed, not theatrically, but with the weight of someone describing consequences rather than strategy. Omar maintained composure, reiterating support for transparency and enforcement. The exchange felt less like a clash and more like two narratives intersecting without fully aligning. Viewers could sense the tension between intention and outcome. Then came questions about campaign expenditures and vendor relationships, areas that often sound technical but carry emotional charge. Kennedy cited public reports about payments, contracts, and the appearance of conflicts. Omar emphasized legality, documentation, and prior reviews by relevant authorities. Lawyers leaned in, papers shuffled, microphones picked up the soft mechanics of caution. Process became the main character. Personal history surfaced, not for spectacle, Kennedy suggested, but because filings and timelines overlapped in ways he found confusing. Omar characterized parts of the inquiry as invasive and politically motivated. Kennedy responded that donors expect clarity about how funds are used, especially in campaigns built on trust. Neither side raised voices. The friction lived in phrasing. It was the kind of exchange where civility and discomfort share the same sentence. At one point, Kennedy asked about past statements that had drawn criticism nationwide. He referenced quotes, dates, and public reactions, framing them as matters of record rather than rhetoric. Omar defended her intent, saying remarks had been misinterpreted and taken out of context. The broader debate, speech, meaning, responsibility, hovered above the specifics. Words travel differently once they leave the room where they were spoken. The hearing took on a reflective tone, less sparring and more reckoning. Kennedy spoke about national memory and the emotional weight certain phrases carry for many Americans. Omar listened, occasionally interjecting, her posture steady even as the atmosphere tightened. The exchange felt less partisan and more personal, though politics never truly left the room. Public life compresses history and identity into moments like these. As the hours passed, the room's energy drained into something quieter, almost contemplative. Supporters who had arrived ready to cheer now watched closely, processing rather than reacting. Reporters typed with the focus of people who knew clips would outlive context. No one declared victory. Hearings rarely work that way. They leave impressions, not verdicts. Near the end, Kennedy asked what public service means when opportunity and responsibility intersect. He spoke about gratitude, stewardship, and the expectations voters place on elected officials. Omar responded by highlighting her record, her constituents, and the broader struggles shaping policy choices. The contrast wasn't about facts so much as framing. Perspective can be as decisive as data. She later suggested the line of questioning felt targeted and unfair. Kennedy answered softly that his focus had been documents, statements, and oversight duties. Observers heard different things depending on what they brought into the room. Some saw accountability, others saw confrontation. Most saw a complicated story with no easy ending. When the gavel finally came down, the room emptied with the strange quiet that follows long tension. Staffers packed binders, cameras powered down, and conversations resumed in low tones. Outside, commentary machines spun instantly, slicing hours into seconds of shareable narrative. The internet loves clarity even when reality resists it. Context rarely trends. In the days that followed, committees discussed reviews, agencies confirmed standard procedures, and advocacy groups issued carefully worded statements. Supporters called the hearing political theater. Critics called it overdue scrutiny. Newsrooms chased angles, timelines, and expert takes. The story expanded beyond one room into a national conversation about trust and transparency. That's how modern politics works. Moments become mirrors. I watched it all thinking less about winners and more about the uneasy space between appearance and assurance. Public records invite questions, and questions don't always imply wrongdoing. Sometimes they simply reflect curiosity. At the same time, reputations are fragile, and insinuation can travel faster than nuance. Balancing scrutiny with fairness is harder than it looks on screen. Democracy depends on both. If there's a lesson, maybe it's that politics is rarely clean theater with tidy scripts. It's messy, human, shaped by tone as much as testimony. People bring history, identity, and expectation into every exchange, and those lenses color what they see. I don't pretend to know every answer, but I know questions matter. And sometimes the most powerful moment in a hearing isn't a punchline or a soundbite, but the silence that follows a question everyone is still trying to process. By nightfall, the hearing had already escaped the room and become something larger, which is what always happens when Washington stops talking to itself and starts performing for the rest of the country. The clip that traveled fastest was not the longest exchange, not the most detailed sequence about disclosures or campaign spending or the mechanics of oversight, but the moment the tone changed and the room seemed to realize it was no longer watching a routine argument. People online cut the hearing into fragments and gave each fragment its own meaning. To supporters of John Kennedy, it looked like old-fashioned accountability delivered with a drawl and a legal pad. To defenders of Ilhan Omar, it looked like a familiar Washington ritual in which suspicion gets dressed up as concern and then sold back to the public as virtue. That split hardened by the hour, and if you watched the cable panels long enough, you could almost forget they were talking about the same event. One network treated the hearing like a civic intervention, the overdue moment when hard questions finally caught up with a public figure who had spent years outrunning them with speed and confidence. Another treated it like an ambush staged for maximum drama, a hearing less interested in facts than in producing clips sharp enough to live forever on social media. The truth, as usual, sat somewhere in the messier middle because hearings are almost never only one thing. They are fact-finding exercises, yes, but they are also theater, message discipline, proxy war, donor signal, and resume line, all happening at once under better lighting than most people have in their homes. By the next morning, every word spoken in that room had been assigned a moral value by somebody with a microphone. The same exchange was being described as devastating, disgraceful, necessary, cynical, overdue, opportunistic, clarifying, and beneath the dignity of the Senate, sometimes by people on the same panel within the same 6-minute segment. Former prosecutors went on air to say some of the questions sounded legitimate even if the performance around them felt carefully engineered. Former campaign operatives said the opposite, that in politics the staging is the substance and anyone pretending otherwise had just arrived in America 5 minutes ago. A few analysts, the rare endangered species who still try to sound boring on television, pointed out that a question can be fair even when the person asking it knows exactly how to make it look cruel. That was the part most viewers understood instinctively, even if they couldn't explain it. Kennedy had not tried to overwhelm the room with an avalanche of technical jargon or obscure references that would take a law degree and 3 interns to decode. He had done what experienced politicians do when they want the public to follow them without effort. He reduced complexity into ordinary language, turned financial discrepancies into kitchen table arithmetic, and translated institutional doubt into the oldest form of doubt there is. If this is straightforward, why does it feel so hard to answer cleanly? That question can be unfair in the wrong hands, but it is powerful because it sounds like common sense, and common sense has a way of beating nuance in a race to the public imagination. Omar's team understood that immediately, which is why their response that evening was less a rebuttal than an attempt to move the frame before it hardened. They said the hearing was designed to create innuendo rather than understanding. They said selective facts had been arranged into a suggestive narrative that invited viewers to reach conclusions the hearing itself never proved. They said the performance depended on an old trick in American politics, the trick of asking charged questions in a soft voice so that the accusation arrives disguised as concern. None of that was a foolish argument. In modern political combat, tone is often the blade, and polite skepticism can leave a mark deeper than open hostility. But the problem for Omar was that tone alone cannot answer arithmetic, and politics remains cruelly attached to visuals. A chart, a number, a sequence of dates, a quote read aloud at the right speed, those things can dominate a news cycle even when the larger story remains unresolved. The hearing had produced images people could understand without reading any follow-up reporting. A senator with one thin folder, a witness with lawyers at both shoulders, long pauses after short questions, supporters filing into the room with certainty, and out of the room with their eyes on their phones. Fair or not, that imagery did its work. Politics is often less about what happened than about what shape it took in the minds of people who caught only 90 seconds between errands. The Democratic leadership, meanwhile, responded the way modern leadership always responds when one of its own has become inconvenient but not yet untouchable, with careful sentences engineered to sound supportive and distancing at the same time. A few members defended Omar directly and called the hearing an obvious exercise in narrative construction, a way of laundering partisan hostility through the language of ethics. Others praised accountability in the abstract, which is how politicians signal discomfort without naming it. One member said the public deserves clear answers from every elected official and then declined to elaborate, which in Washington is the rhetorical equivalent of watching someone close the door very quietly. Nobody wanted to get too far ahead of the story, but nobody wanted to stand too close to it either. Republicans, by contrast, did what winning teams always do after a clean media moment. They simplified. They did not want 10 subplots when one would do. Their version was that Kennedy had asked ordinary questions and Omar had failed to give ordinary answers. That was enough. They did not need every claim to hold up under microscopic legal review in the next 24 hours because the political point had already landed. In politics, as in boxing, the punch people remember is usually the one they saw clearly, not the one that scored best with judges. Still, underneath the spin and the posture, there was a more serious question hanging over the whole episode, and it had less to do with Omar personally than with what the public has come to expect from modern representatives. Voters say they want authenticity until authenticity becomes messy. They say they want fighters until fighting starts to look like evasion. They say they hate polished non-answers, but they also punish hesitation, over-explanation, and any sentence that sounds less than airtight. The political class has adapted by learning to speak in fortified paragraphs, language built to survive hostile editing. Kennedy's advantage in that hearing was that he sounded like someone who had walked in from outside that fortified world, even though, of course, he hadn't. He has been in politics long enough to know exactly how the machinery works. He just knows how to disguise sophistication as plain speech, and that is one of the oldest tricks in the Republic. Some of Omar's allies tried to push back by reminding people who she is and why she has always provoked outsized reaction. They argued that no matter what she says or how carefully she says it, part of the country has already decided what she represents and will interpret every controversy through that lens. There is truth in that, too. Omar has spent years functioning not only as a lawmaker but as a symbol, and symbols are judged by rules harsher than those applied to ordinary members. The public does not just listen to what symbols say. It projects onto them. It resents them. It recruits them into fights that began long before they walked into the room. Yet being a symbol does not erase the burden of explanation. In some ways, it increases it. The more a public figure embodies larger arguments about immigration, identity, religion, power, and political grievance, the less room there is for muddy answers on narrower questions. That may be unfair, but unfairness is not exactly a bug in American politics. It is built into the wiring. A representative who has spent years speaking with moral certainty cannot suddenly ask for endless interpretive generosity the moment the spotlight turns around. Voters may forgive many things, but they are not famous for admiring asymmetry. By the second day, reporters who had initially treated the hearing as a media event began doing the slower work that should always come first and usually comes second: They started calling ethics lawyers, campaign finance specialists, former House counsel, forensic accountants, and state officials who know the difference between a real discrepancy and a discrepancy that only looks suspicious because disclosure forms were built by sadists. Some experts said the public routinely misunderstands broad asset ranges, and that business valuations on disclosure forms can look absurd even when they are technically permissible. Others said that while disclosure systems are imperfect, large swings paired with aggressive public messaging naturally invite scrutiny. The country was left with what it usually gets from expert review: fewer absolutes and more caveats, which means almost nobody changed their mind. The most disciplined coverage focused not on declaring anyone guilty of anything, because hearings do not decide guilt, and responsible journalists are supposed to know that, but on whether Omar's explanations match the ordinary standard voters apply when trust is involved. That standard is not especially legalistic. Most people do not ask whether a disclosure category allowed a number to be reported a certain way. They ask whether the explanation sounds like the kind of explanation they themselves would get away with if the IRS, a bank, a school board, or a skeptical uncle happened to ask a few follow-up questions over Thanksgiving. Public trust lives at that level. The law may be one thing, the smell test is another. Political careers can survive the first and die from the second. Omar herself returned to that same argument in a subsequent interview, saying that the hearing had been built around suggestion, and that suggestion is the most dangerous currency in public life because it lets critics plant conclusions they are too careful to state directly. She was not wrong about the method. The hearing was full of implication, pacing, juxtaposition, and contrast. It was constructed less like a legal argument than like a sequence in a prestige drama where the camera lingers on the witness's face just long enough to let the audience do the writing. But there was a risk in leaning too hard on that critique. Once a politician argues primarily about the style of the question rather than the substance beneath it, some voters hear sophistication and others hear smoke. Kennedy, for his part, played the aftermath with discipline. He did not run to every camera available. He gave a small number of interviews and kept his lines narrow. Oversight matters, questions matter, public office is public trust. He understood what many politicians forget after a successful hit. The best way to preserve a moment is not to over-explain it. He let the clips breathe. He let defenders overreact on his behalf and critics sharpen his image by denouncing it. There is a reason he has survived as long as he has. He knows that in politics, the person who says less after a strong performance often ends up sounding more credible than the person still trying to explain everything 3 days later. There was also something else at work, something less ideological and more emotional. A lot of voters, including some who do not particularly like Kennedy and have never voted Republican in their lives, are exhausted by the permanent evasiveness of public life. They are tired of hearing highly educated people answer narrow questions with abstract sociology, answer arithmetic with autobiography, answer timelines with grievances, and answer criticism with indictments of motive. Sometimes those broader arguments are fair and necessary. Sometimes they are the whole story, but sometimes they sound like an expensive suit wrapped around the oldest political instinct in the world: stall until the camera cuts away. Kennedy's power in that hearing came from acting like the camera would not cut away, and neither would he. That does not make him a neutral figure, and anyone pretending he walked into that room as a humble vessel of nonpartisan truth should probably lie down until the dizziness passes. John Kennedy is a politician, which means he is as capable of calculation as breathing. He knew exactly which lines would travel, exactly which pauses would feel devastating, exactly how to play the country lawyer without surrendering the advantage of elite fluency. His folksiness is not accidental, it is a delivery system. The man can turn a single sentence into a county fair proverb and make it sound like he just thought of it while waiting on catfish. That is talent, but let's not confuse talent with innocence. Even so, a performance can be calculated and still reveal something real. That is the part partisans hate admitting. The fact that Kennedy wanted the moment does not prove the moment meant nothing. The fact that Omar has faced genuinely ugly attacks before does not mean every uncomfortable question belongs in that category. Politics has trained millions of Americans to think in binaries because binaries are emotionally efficient. Either she was railroaded or she was exposed. Either he was grandstanding or he was telling hard truths. Real life is usually far more annoying than that. It allows both theater and substance to occupy the same hour. As the week wore on, the real danger for Omar was not any single allegation or single headline. It was the cumulative effect of uncertainty. Uncertainty is corrosive in politics because it invites others to narrate your story for you. Every public figure survives controversy by doing one of two things quickly. Either produce a crisp, comprehensible explanation that ordinary people can repeat to one another, or shift the conversation onto ground where your coalition feels morally energized enough to defend you without hesitation. Omar's camp tried the second route, but the hearing had been built to frustrate it. Kennedy had made the story sound less like ideology and more like bookkeeping. And bookkeeping is hard to polarize when the public already assumes everyone in Washington is doing something creative with the decimal points. There were signs by the weekend that even some of her friendlier media allies were adjusting their language, not abandoning her, not quite, but sanding down the certainty. Phrases like politically motivated attack gave way to phrases like serious questions, disputed interpretations, unresolved issues, and the need for fuller documentation. That shift may sound minor to civilians, but in media terms, it is the difference between a shield and a raincoat. A shield says, "Stand behind me." A raincoat says, "The weather looks bad and you're on your own after the parking lot." What happens after moments like this is almost always slower and less cinematic than viewers expect. There are no immediate endings, no final monologues, no dramatic resignations timed to the top of the hour. There are reviews, memos, requests for records, more statements from people paid too much to use too many words, and perhaps eventually some conclusion that arrives months later after the public has moved on to 3 newer scandals and 1 celebrity divorce. But slow endings do not erase fast impressions. A public image can be altered in one afternoon, even when the institutional consequences take forever. In that sense, the hearing had already done its work regardless of where any formal process might lead, and that, in the end, was why the day mattered. Not because it proved everything critics wanted, proved or disproved everything defenders wanted dismissed. It mattered because it punctured something. It punctured the assumption that charisma can always outrun scrutiny, that symbolic power can always absorb contradiction, that media fluency can always keep the frame from tightening. Maybe the questions will eventually look overblown. Maybe some will dissolve under closer inspection. Maybe others will linger longer than Omar's allies would like. But once the public sees a politician struggling to keep narrative control under sustained pressure, they rarely forget the feeling of it. Politics is emotional memory dressed up as argument. So the room emptied, the clips spread, the panels talked, the lawyers wrote, and the voters kept doing what voters always do when elites insist something is either simple or complicated depending on the needs of the hour. They watched, they guessed, they compared tone to substance and instinct to paperwork. And somewhere between Kennedy's soft drawl and Omar's sharpened defiance, the country found itself staring at a very old American question in a very modern costume. When power is challenged in public, who sounds like they are protecting the truth, and who sounds like they are protecting the right to keep explaining it later?